Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 5.1, Introduction to Soil Systems. The first big idea is that soils are systems. This is an ESS class, so you've got to approach soils as a system with inputs, outputs, storages, and flows. The soil system can be illustrated by a soil profile, which has a layered structure. You can see those here on the screen. The top layer is the O horizon, and one of the most important characteristics of the O horizon is that it has a lot of nutrients in it. It has lots of decayed organic material called humus in it. This is where a tremendous amount of growth in soils takes place. The next horizon is the A horizon, which is where you get aggregation of more mineral content mixing in very nicely with a lot of those nutrients. As you go deeper into the soils, from the O horizon down through the A, B, C, and R horizons, the ratio of organic matter to mineral content shifts from a high organic matter content in the O horizon to predominantly bedrock in the R horizon. That parent bedrock is what determines the mineral content of your soils. You'll notice in this graph that the bulk of what's in soils are the abiotic components, the mineral particles, the air, and the water, and that only a small proportion comes from living organisms or from dead or decaying organic matter. You don't need to know these percentages, just know that the bulk of soils is made up of minerals, air, and water. There's two main transfers within soils, the first of which is called biological mixing. This is where the organisms that live in those top layers of soil literally churn and move around a lot of the materials that are in soil. So you have things like earthworms or other invertebrates that are tunneling through the soils. You might have organisms such as moles or other rodents who again are burrowing into the soils, and as they burrow they move things around without changing the state of matter. That's why it's a transfer. Another big transfer in soils is the downward movement of minerals that follows water as water percolates from the soil surface down into those deeper layers. This is called leaching, which is the downward loss of nutrients from those top layers, their movement or transfer into lower horizons of the soils. If they go low enough, then plant roots can't access them, and they have been lost to living organisms above. This systems diagram shows different inputs of organic material, including leaf litter. That's all the leaves that fall onto the surface of the ground from plants that live in that area. You also get the parent material, that's the bedrock down there in the R horizon of your soils. And as that parent material is slowly eroded or weathered over millennia, it contributes to smaller and smaller bits of rock that are in the soil and make up that mineral content. You also have precipitation, so rain, snow, sleet, any of that water that falls out of the atmosphere as it moves downward through the soil. That's an input of water, so that's precipitation. You also have an input of energy into the soils because soils will absorb sunlight when they're exposed to direct light. They'll warm up. They will gain energy that way. They also gain a lot of chemical energy in the form of the biomass that is dropped into the soils as that leaf litter. Outputs of matter in soil are uptake of water and nutrients via plant roots. You'll also have outputs of different matter in soils due to soil erosion. So in the soil itself, particles of soil itself leave the system due to rapid movement of water or wind. That's soil erosion. That's an output of matter from soils. Transformations in soil. The big ones here are decomposition, weathering, and nutrient cycling. Decomposition is simply the breaking down of organic matter from living organisms into smaller and simpler chemical compounds. Weathering is the very slow breakdown of, in particular, the parent rock, which are large pieces of rock, into much smaller pieces of rock, eventually getting as small as sand, silt, and clay. The third big transformation in soils are nutrient cycles. The ones that you really should know are nitrogen and carbon cycles. The carbon cycle obviously has a connection with photosynthesis and respiration that happens. A lot of that is going on in the atmosphere. As that carbon that's been fixed into plant biomass is then returned into the soil, it gets broken down through decomposition into simpler compounds and is available for uptake again. You should definitely know parts of the nitrogen cycle as example of transformations within soil. You want to know that there are bacteria that live in close conjunction and cooperation with different plants, particularly your leguminous plants, and that those bacteria are responsible for what a process called nitrogen fixation, where they actually break down that diatomic nitrogen from the atmosphere, that N2, and they change it or transform it into a form called nitrates or NO3. The other big idea in this topic is that the quality of the soil influences the productivity of an area. There are three main soil particles you need to know about: sand, silt, and clay. And as you see here on the screen, sand is the largest particle, silt is a smaller particle, and clay is represented by a single pixel on the screen. The size differences in these particles is significant because it determines how closely they fit together. Coarse sand, the biggest sand particles, leave a lot of gaps between them. They don't stack together the way that bricks do in a wall, whereas clay particles are so small they fit very, very tightly together and they leave very little pore space between them. That pore space is critically important to the structure of soils because it's where the water and the air exist. An important tool for discussing the texture and structure of soils is a soil texture triangle. And all this does is it shows you the ratio of sand, silt, and clay in a given soil sample. And you read it just like you would read an XY coordinate grid in mathematics, except there are three grids here. Sand is across the bottom, and as you see the tilt of the numbers along that x-axis, that's the angle at which you're going to follow those lines for sand. Clay, up the left side of it, you'll notice that those numbers are perfectly horizontal, and so the horizontal lines in the middle of the triangle represent the percentage of clay in the sample, and then similarly, silt is found along the right side. So if you look at the red dot in the bottom right corner of the screen, you can see that this sample, if you follow the line down to the bottom right, shows that it's 20% sand. You go to the left, it's 20% clay, and then you go up to the right, and it tells you that it's 60% silt. That's how you read a soil triangle. So what are the percentages that you see of the sand, silt, and clay where that blue dot is in the bottom center in that loam part of soil? If you came up with 40% sand, 35% silt, and 25% clay, you understand how to read a soil triangle. Remember that the name of this topic is soil systems, and this is an environmental systems and societies class. So you've got to picture soils as systems, and you have to treat soils as systems. So on your exam, you may be asked to outline the transfers, the transformations, the inputs, the outputs, the flows, and the storages within soil systems. So you're going to have to think about all of the water that's entering the soil from precipitation and the way that water percolates downwards due to gravity and moves through the soil. That's a transfer. You need to remember that when that water is moving, it is carrying nutrients with it. So you'll get downward leaching of nutrients. So that's another transfer or flow of nutrients. It may be an output from top layers of soil into inputs into bottom layers of soil. You'll also have inputs of nutrients into the soil through the processes of decomposition. You'll have outputs of nutrients from the soil when plants take them up. We call that uptake through the roots. So when you are discussing soils on your ESS exam, be sure to frame it all in terms of inputs, outputs, flows, and storages, because it is a system. If you're challenged to explain how soil can be viewed as an ecosystem, remember that it has both abiotic and biotic components. Abiotic components of soil come from the mineral content that results from the weathering of the parent bedrock down there in the R horizon at the bottom of the soil profile. Other abiotic components in the soils are the air and the water that are found in those pore spaces, or those gaps between the soil particles. The biotic components of soil ecosystem are all of the organisms that live within the soils. Some of those may be fungi, some will be invertebrates. You'll have a bunch of bacteria, but you also might have some more complex organisms like vertebrates such as rodents, rabbits, moles that burrow through the soil. Those organisms contribute to what we call the biological mixing, where they churn the soil, they mix up the soil particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay, and they blend it with all of the organic matter. You should be able to compare and contrast the structure and property of soils based on their texture, based on the ratios of the sand, silt, and clay. Sand, being the largest particles with the largest gaps between it, tends to drain well. It tends to aerate quite well, meaning it allows more air into it. Clay, with too much clay, because the particles are so small and they pack so tightly together, they inhibit drainage and they hold water, so they tend to get waterlogged. That's why we use clay to make like ceramics and pots, because it holds water, it becomes impervious. Silt is a nice blend. It's big enough that there is some airspace in between the particles and some water space between the particles, but it's not so big that it drains really quickly and dries out too fast for plants to grow. Ideally, what you want is a soil that has a blend of all three of these. You want sand in there to promote drainage, drainage and facilitate root growth. You want silt to be able to hang on to water and nutrients long enough to make them available for plants to grow. And you also want a little bit of clay in there to make sure that the water doesn't move vertically downward through the soil so fast that you end up having a bunch of nutrients leached out. You may be given a soil texture triangle and given a couple of different samples on that texture triangle and have to compare and contrast soils from different places. You need to refer to the sand, silt, and clay content and discuss the characteristics of each of those particles and their influence on how the soils operate. That's it for topic 5.1, soil systems. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. You can also find more materials for ESS over at my website, www.mrcreamerscience.com. Thanks for watching and happy learning. Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 5.2, terrestrial food production systems. Let's get into it. Terrestrial food production systems are complex and their sustainability depends on a variety of factors. Just like a three-legged stool needs all its legs to stand, sustainable food production requires a balance of social, economic, and environmental considerations. Consumers play a big role in the system through their food choices, which can support or challenge different production methods. Food availability varies greatly around the world. In more developed countries, consumers have a wide array of choices in supermarkets. Its abundance stems from differences in wealth, infrastructure like roads and electricity, and government policies. However, this uneven distribution can lead to conflicts, especially as suitable farmland isn't equitably distributed across the world. Many factors influence how sustainable our food production is. These range from the scale of the farming operations to the types of seeds and crops that we choose. For example, big industrial farms might use lots of machinery and fossil fuels, while smaller farms might rely more on manual labor. Water use, fertilizers, and pest control methods all play a part too. Even things like antibiotics and livestock and government regulations can impact sustainability. And a lot of these factors are different between MEDCs, more economically developed countries, and LEDCs, less economically developed countries. There's a stark contrast in how food is produced around the world. While some regions use high-tech industrialized methods, others rely on traditional small-scale farming. This difference isn't just about technology. It reflects bigger inequalities in resources, knowledge, and market access. Those are particularly apparent, again, in those differences between LEDCs and MEDCs. These disparities affect not only how much food is produced, but also who has access to it. Food waste is a global issue, but it looks different depending on where you are. In Vancouver, Canada, for instance, you might see perfectly good food thrown away at markets. In richer countries, we often waste food at home or in restaurants. But in poorer countries, food might spoil before it reaches consumers due to a lack of proper storage, transportation, or a degraded infrastructure network like roads with lots of potholes or which wash away rainy season or bad weather. Addressing food waste requires understanding these different patterns. Our food choices are influenced by more than just hunger. Cultural traditions, economic situations, and even political systems all play a role too. For example, a traditional farming scene might reflect deep-rooted cultural practices. These factors are all interconnected. A change in one area can ripple through the entire food system. As ecologist Barry Commoner said, everything is connected to everything else. The food system is like a complex machine with a bunch of different parts. It starts with producing food on farms and then involves processing, packaging, transporting that food to markets, and along the way, a lot of different factors come into play. Climate change and weather events can affect crop yields, while economic policies might influence food prices. Understanding these connections helps us see how changes in one area can impact the whole system. As our global human population grows, we're facing a squeeze on farmland. In 1960, there was about 0.42 hectares of arable land available per person globally, but by the year 2050, that's expected to shrink to just 0.14 hectares per person, or a third of what it previously was. This trend is driven by population growth, but also by urbanization eating up farmland and soil degradation, making some land that used to be arable no longer usable. Not all foods are created equal when it comes to land use. Meat production takes up a whopping 77% of global farmland, but provides only 17% of our calories. In contrast, plant-based foods use only 23% of farmland, but give us globally 83% of all the calories that we consume around the world. This huge difference shows why eating lower on the food chain, more plants, less meat, can be more efficient and sustainable. It also has major implications for climate change, which we study later on in the syllabus. In many cultures, eating meat is seen as a sign of wealth or status, but this cultural preference has a big environmental impact. The more often people eat meat, the more land is needed for farming. For example, if everyone ate meat at every meal, we'd need a lot more farmland than if people ate meat less frequently. This shows how our cultural food choices can have far-reaching consequences. As people get richer, they tend to change their diet. Often, this means eating more meat and other animal products. However, these foods generally have a bigger environmental footprint. Beef, for instance, has a much higher impact on things like greenhouse gas emissions and water use compared to most plant-based foods. There's a big difference between diverse, small-scale farming and large industrial agriculture. Small-scale, diverse farms often grow a bunch of different crops, they use a lot more human labor, and they work within natural processes like seasonal rainfall. Industrial farms, on the other hand, might focus on just one or two crops in a big monoculture. They rely heavily on machines and chemicals, and they aim for maximum yield. They're not as susceptible to those seasonal changes because they also generally will have things like large-scale irrigation systems in place. Each of these systems has its pros and its cons in terms of productivity, environmental impact, and the social effects. One way to make our food system more sustainable is to change what we eat. Reducing meat consumption and eating more plant-based foods can make a big difference. Local and organic foods can also help by reducing transportation needs and chemical use. However, it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Best diet depends on many factors, including individual health needs and local food availability. Food labels can be a powerful tool for sustainability, but only if you know how to read them. These labels can tell us a lot about nutritional content, the ingredients in the food, and sometimes how the food was produced. By making informed choices based on that information, consumers can support more sustainable food systems. Ensuring sustainable food production isn't just up to farmers. It requires oversight and cooperation. Government agencies and international organizations play a big role in setting and enforcing standards. This might involve several different aspects, from soil health and water use to biodiversity or fair label practices. Effective monitoring and control can help make sure that our food is produced in ways that are good for people and for the planet. Buffer zones around farmland can be a simple but effective way to reduce agriculture's environmental impact. These areas of natural vegetation capture excess nutrients and sediment before they can pollute waterways. It's a great example of how we can work with nature to make farming more sustainable. By implementing soil conservation practices like this, we can produce the food we need while also protecting our ecosystems. Crop yields vary greatly around the world, and they've changed over time. In the United States, for example, corn yields have increased dramatically since the 1960s, thanks to advances in technology and farming practices. However, yields in many developing countries remain much lower. This kind of data helps us understand global food security challenges and imbalances, and shows us the potential for improving production in different regions. There are many different ways to produce food, each with its own characteristics. Commercial farming aims to produce food for sale, often focusing on a single crop and using a bunch of technology. Subsistence farming, on the other hand, produces just enough to feed a family. Some farms are intensive, using a lot of labor and resources on a small area, while others are extensive, spreading out over large areas. Understanding these differences helps us evaluate the sustainability of different farming methods. Terrestrial food production can have significant environmental impacts. That includes soil erosion, water pollution from fertilizers and pesticides, habitat loss, and contributions to climate change. The severity of these impacts often depends on the farming methods that are used. By understanding these effects, we can build more sustainable farming practices that produce the food we need while minimizing environmental damage. Food production is deeply connected to social and cultural systems. For example, poor soil health can lead to low crop yields, which then results in food insecurity and poverty. This in turn makes it harder for farmers to invest in improving their soil, and the cycle continues. Understanding these connections is really important for developing sustainable food systems that not only produce enough food, but also support people's well-being. There are many strategies we can use to make food production more sustainable. This includes precision agriculture to use resources more efficiently, integrated pest management to reduce chemical use, and crop rotation to maintain soil health. We can also work on reducing food waste and finding ways to store carbon in agricultural soils. When we combine these approaches, we can build a food system that meets our needs without compromising the planet's health or the ability of future generations to meet their needs. That, by definition, is sustainable agriculture. Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 5.3 Soil Degradation and Conservation. By the end of this video, you should understand how soils develop, how human activities impact soil health, and what we can do to preserve this vital resource. Let's get into it. Let's begin with our first significant idea. Fertile soils require significant time to develop through the process of succession, which we studied back in topic 2. As you can see in this illustration, soils get deeper and become more biologically complex over time. They start as a really shallow layer of windblown dust and lightly weathered rock. As subsequent generations of mosses, lichens, and plants grow and deposit more biomass, they gradually add organic matter to the soil matrix, and that improves soil fertility. Looking at this detailed diagram of soil development, we can observe how soil horizons form over time. Starting with bare rock, pioneer species like lichens begin the weathering process. Small annual plants then follow, then perennial shrubs and grasses, eventually leading to more complex plant communities. With each stage, the soil becomes richer and deeper. Our second significant idea states that human activities may reduce soil fertility and increase soil erosion. When we examine erosion in this landscape, we can see how soil degradation often results from changes in land use patterns and management practices. Here's a stark example of soil erosion caused by high salinity in the water table from Australia's capital territory. This shows how human activities can trigger a cascade of soil degradation processes. The third significant idea in this topic introduces us to soil conservation strategies. These exist and can be used to preserve soil fertility and reduce soil erosion. We're going to examine several of them in detail. The first key concept we need to understand is how soil ecosystems change through succession. Back in content statement 5.3.1, we learned that fertile soil contains a community of organisms that all work together to maintain functioning nutrient cycles. These organisms are also what helps make the soil resistant to erosion. Moving on to our understanding of human impacts, we see how intensive grazing can significantly affect soil health. When you take a look at this image, consider 3 critical factors. First, what the animals eat. Second, how many animals are present. And third, the impact of soil compaction from all of their hooves stamping around the ground for so long. Urbanization presents another major challenge to soil conservation. Check out this aerial view of Barcelona in Spain. Where do you think things grow in this picture? This question becomes increasingly important as cities expand onto formerly productive agricultural land. As those cities get bigger and bigger, the amount of green space dedicated becomes smaller and smaller. Here we can see the effects of over-irrigation in Western Australia. This shows how improper irrigation practices can lead to soil salinization. And that's just one of the serious consequences of reduced soil fertility. When you look at this monoculture soybean field in North America, we need to consider several different factors. The food supply for pests, the impacts on biodiversity and food webs, the increased need for herbicides and pesticides to keep those populations under control, and the importance of crop rotation. When we compare different agricultural approaches, you're going to find that commercial, industrialized food production systems generally tend to reduce soil fertility more than small-scale subsistence farming methods. It's not universally true, that's a generalization, but broadly speaking, commercial food production systems will reduce soil fertility more than your small-scale subsistence farmers do. This key understanding helps us evaluate different approaches to soil management, and that's something you might see on your ESS exams. Speaking of sustainable practices, let's take a look at this example of small-scale farming in Kenya. Notice how bean and banana intercropping demonstrates key principles of soil conservation, particularly diverse crop selection and natural nutrient cycling. The beans and the bananas have different nutrient requirements, and therefore they place different demands on the soil. This detailed landscape shows us how soil erosion develops over time. Highland forests in the background naturally intercept and slow rainfall, and their roots absorb water and they hold the soils in place. Then the leaf litter adds organic matter to the soils, and that improves nutrient levels and fertility. So this system provides a model for sustainable soil management. When forests are replaced with agricultural fields, that disrupts this natural balance that we saw in the previous image. The nutrient cycle is interrupted and roots no longer hold soil in place. That represents a critical turning point or a tipping point in soil degradation. Because the roots aren't holding the soil in place, you get increases in rates of erosion and you start to see nutrient levels falling away. The consequences become even more apparent as thin layers of soil nutrients are rapidly lost during agricultural harvesting. Right? That top layer of soil is where we grow all of our agricultural crops. When crops are removed from the land without proper nutrient replacement, you're going to see a dramatic decline in soil fertility over just a few growing seasons. That's part of what pushes and drives and perpetuates slash and burn style agriculture. Without nutrients, neither trees nor crops can grow effectively. Gullies start to form because there are no more roots to absorb the water or hold the soil in place. And all that runoff carries more and more topsoil downhill. When that topsoil goes away, it carries the nutrients away with it, and that creates a destructive, positive feedback loop. What makes this situation particularly challenging is that soil degradation and soil loss forces farmers to cut more forest and plant on more and more extreme slopes in search of fertile land to grow crops. And that perpetuates the soil loss cycle. This connects directly to our understanding of human impacts discussed in Content Statement 5.3 and going all the way back to those feedback loops that we discussed in Topic 1. Take a look at this detailed cross-section of the landscape. You can see how different human activities contribute to soil toxification, from forest fires and volcanic activities in the atmosphere to industrial effluents and agricultural chemicals at ground level, potentially toxic elements entering the soil through multiple pathways. That's a lot of human impacts on our soil system. If we understand all those processes, we can develop more effective soil protection strategies. Let's take a look at the process of salinization a little more closely. When we use flood or ditch irrigation with mineral-rich water, evapotranspiration leaves these minerals behind. As the water evaporates off the surface of the soil, the water goes away and all those minerals that were in the water are left behind. That's what we call salt. Over time, the salts build up and they eventually reach levels that exceed what plants can tolerate. And that makes the soil increasingly hostile to plant growth. This represents one of the 4 major consequences of reduced soil fertility that we discussed earlier. So far, we've looked at a lot of problems. Now let's take a look at solutions. So we're going to talk about soil conservation measures. Soil conditioners, particularly organic materials like compost, play a really important role in maintaining soil health. This image from Haiti shows the dramatic difference that adding organic matter can make to soil productivity. On the left, you can see healthy sorghum that's growing in composted soil. But on the right-hand side, all the plants are stunted because that soil hasn't been treated and it doesn't have nearly as many nutrients, and it doesn't have the compost's ability to hold on to more water and make it available for the plants. Soil conditioners improve soil quality in several different ways. They enhance nutrient content, they increase the soil surface area, and they improve water retention. The deep black color of well-composted soil indicates high levels of organic matter and nutrients that are available to plants. Think of compost as mimicking nature's own nutrient cycling process. It's like a human way to create the humus that is there in the top layers of soils, particularly in forests. We can compare different scales of composting operations. While commercial composting facilities process large volumes of organic matter mechanically, subsistence farmers often create smaller, manually maintained compost piles. Both approaches contribute to soil health, but their scale and their methods differ pretty significantly. Let's take a look at wind reduction techniques. This diagram shows how strategically placed windbreaks protect crops and soils. Notice how the protected zone is 8 or 10 times wider than the height of the trees planted as the windbreak. This kind of a system not only prevents soil erosion, but it can also reduce soil evaporation, and it can create beneficial microclimates for crops.
Another significant benefit of windbreaks is how they create multiple positive effects in agricultural systems. Beyond reducing wind erosion, they help manage drifting snow, they protect livestock, they provide wildlife habitat, and with the right crops, they even enhance pollination by creating shelter for beneficial insects like bees. This kind of an integrated approach to soil conservation demonstrates how natural solutions can help serve multiple purposes. This is when human interventions mimic natural systems. We're looking at how all those different parts fit together. Cultivation techniques represent another important soil conservation strategy. Here, you can see how terracing transforms really steep hillsides into productive agricultural land. Before they were terraced, these hills would have been subject to really intense soil erosion, as we saw in earlier slides. But by creating level platforms for farming, the terraces really dramatically slow the movement of both wind and water across the soil surface. And that prevents erosion while making agriculture a lot easier on otherwise really challenging terrain. It does require a tremendous input of labor to install in the first place, but when terraces are done right, they will last many years or even many human generations. And so over the long term, they pay off. Contour plowing is another soil conservation technique, and it's kind of like terracing, just on a much smaller scale. It's like little mini terraces in the field. By following the natural contours of the land, where essentially you're plowing across hills instead of up and down them, farmers create what we might think of as those little mini terraces between the crop rows. These subtle ridges significantly slow the horizontal movement of water across fields, and that reduces erosion, and it also helps retain both soil and moisture where the crops need it most. Crop rotation represents one of our most powerful soil conservation tools, and it's been used by many cultures for many, many generations. This systematic approach addresses multiple aspects of soil health at the same time. Different crops have different nutrient demands, so when we rotate through a sequence of crops, that helps maintain soil fertility, because different crops take different nutrients out of the soil, and different crops also add different nutrients back into the soil while they're growing, especially when we include nitrogen-fixing legumes like beans or clover that naturally replenish nutrients that have been depleted by heavy feeders like corn. Additionally, rotation disrupts pest cycles, and it helps improve nutrition for subsistence farmers. When we disrupt those pest cycles, it also reduces the need for farmers to buy and apply pesticides. So it becomes more sustainable from a biodiversity perspective, and it also becomes more economically sustainable, particularly for your subsistence farmers. Companion planting, or intercropping, takes this concept further. By growing multiple crop species together, we can optimize nutrient use, we can minimize pest problems, enhance biodiversity, and improve the overall system resilience. Notice how different plants occupy different vertical spaces and root zones, and that makes much more efficient use of all the available resources on that site. This world map illustrates how soil degradation varies across regions, with notable differences between temperate and tropical zones, as well as between more and less economically developed countries, your MEDCs and your LEDCs. If you can understand these kinds of patterns, that helps you write about more effective, locally appropriate conservation strategies on your exams. As we consider soil degradation and conservation, we have to recognize both how our understanding has changed and how different cultural perspectives influence soil management practices. This connects back to broader questions about how we measure progress in environmental science and how timescales affect our perception of change. Let's review a few key relationships that we've explored. First, the connection between soil ecosystem succession and fertility. Second, the various ways that human activities can impact soils. Third, the range of management strategies that are available for both commercial and subsistence farming systems. That's it for topic 5.3, soil degradation and conservation. Until next time, happy learning.